October 16, 1962, Washington, D.C. The White House Situation Room filled with cigarette smoke and tension. President John F. Kennedy sat at the head of the table, studying photographs spread before him. Black and white aerial images from a U-2 spy plane flight over Cuba. His advisors leaned in, pointing at patterns on the ground near San Cristobal. "Mr. President, these are missile sites," CIA Director John McCone said. "Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles. They can reach Washington in under 15 minutes. Kennedy lit another cigarette. His hand was steady, but his jaw clenched. "How certain are we?" An Air Force photo interpreter stepped forward. He placed a ruler on the photograph and pointed to specific measurements. "Sir, we compared these dimensions with specifications we obtained from a source inside Soviet military intelligence. The launch erector matches exactly. These are R-12 Divina missiles, 1 megaton warhead, 2,000-kilometer range. Every major city on the East Coast is within range." The room went silent. Kennedy looked around the table at his advisors. Some looked shocked. Others looked grim. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "How many missiles?" Kennedy asked. "At least 16 sites under construction, sir. Possibly 24 missiles total. And we believe more are en route by ship." General Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, leaned forward. "Mr. President, we need to strike immediately. Destroy the sites before they become operational. Follow up with a full invasion of Cuba. We can have troops on the ground in 72 hours. Kennedy shook his head. "And Soviet casualties?" "Unavoidable, sir. Soviet technicians are working the sites. Some will be killed." "And then what happens?" LeMay did not answer immediately. Everyone in the room knew. If American bombs killed Soviet soldiers, Moscow would retaliate. Khrushchev would have no choice. The situation would escalate to nuclear war. Kennedy turned to McCone. "This source inside Soviet intelligence, how reliable is he?" "Completely reliable, Mr. President. He has provided intelligence for 18 months. Every piece has checked out. Technical specifications, order of battle, command structures. His reporting on Soviet missile capabilities has been flawless." "What else has he told us?" McCone pulled a folder from his briefcase. "He reported that these missiles require hours to prepare for launch. The warheads are stored separately. The fuel must be loaded. Launch crews need at least 2 hours for final checks. Sir, this means the missiles in Cuba are not yet operational. We have time." Kennedy stood and walked to the window. Outside, tourists strolled along Pennsylvania Avenue. Families took photographs. Children ran across the lawn. None of them knew that the world was 13 days away from nuclear war. "Gentlemen," Kennedy said quietly, "I will not start World War III based on assumptions. I want every piece of intelligence on Soviet missile capabilities. I want to know exactly what we are facing. And I want options other than immediate war." What Kennedy did not say aloud was that he owed this moment of clarity to a man he had never met. A Soviet colonel named Oleg Penkovsky, who was, at that very moment, walking the streets of Moscow under KGB surveillance, carrying secrets that would determine whether the world survived the next 2 weeks. April 23, 1919. Vladikavkaz, a city in the North Caucasus Mountains. Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky was born into a country tearing itself apart. The Russian Civil War raged. Red Army soldiers fought White Army forces in the streets. His father, Vladimir Penkovsky, was a mining engineer who had joined the White Army. He believed in the old Russia, the Tsarist Russia that had just been swept away. Vladimir Penkovsky never lived to see his son grow up. He was killed in 1919, either shot in battle or executed after capture. The records are unclear, deliberately obscured by history. What is certain is that young Oleg grew up without a father, in a household marked by suspicion. His mother, Maria Petrovna, worked as a schoolteacher. She never remarried. She raised Oleg alone, teaching him discipline, caution, and the art of survival in Stalin's Soviet Union. She taught him a critical lesson: never speak about his father. Never mention the White Army. That history was dangerous. Oleg was a bright student. He excelled in mathematics and showed natural leadership abilities. But his family background created a permanent shadow. When he applied to university, he was rejected. The children of White Army officers were not trusted. The Soviet system offered him only one path forward: the Red Army. In 1937, at age 18, Oleg enrolled in the 2nd Kiev Artillery School. He threw himself into his studies with fierce determination. If he could not escape his father's legacy, he would overwhelm it with achievement. He graduated second in his class in 1939 and received his commission as a lieutenant. His first assignment was as a political officer, a commissar attached to an artillery battery. This was not a combat role, but a political one, ensuring soldiers remained loyal to the Communist Party. In September 1939, when the Soviet Union invaded Poland, Lieutenant Penkovsky marched with his unit across the border. He was 20 years old and had never seen combat. The Polish campaign was brief. Resistance collapsed within weeks. Penkovsky earned commendations for his work maintaining morale. 3 months later, in December 1939, he experienced real war. The Soviet Union attacked Finland in what became known as the Winter War. The Finnish campaign was a disaster. Soviet forces outnumbered the Finns 10-1, but suffered catastrophic losses. Finnish snipers picked off Soviet officers. Finnish ski troops ambushed Soviet columns on frozen roads. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Penkovsky saw entire companies freeze to death in the forests of Karelia. He learned lessons that would shape his entire life. He learned that superior numbers meant nothing without intelligence. He learned that propaganda and reality were different things. Soviet newspapers claimed glorious victories while he watched his men die from frostbite and poor planning. He learned that the Soviet military was not invincible, that the leadership made mistakes, and that those mistakes cost lives. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Penkovsky was serving at the Moscow Artillery School. The invasion caught Soviet forces completely unprepared. Within weeks, German armies advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Penkovsky was reassigned to the staff of the Moscow Military District. He coordinated artillery support during the desperate defense of Moscow in the winter of 1941. He saw the city prepare for siege. He watched civilians dig anti-tank ditches in frozen ground. He saw trainloads of wounded soldiers arrive from the front. He saw what war truly meant. In 1943, Penkovsky was transferred to a combat command. He became commander of an artillery battalion in the 27th Artillery Regiment, 1st Ukrainian Front. He led his unit through some of the fiercest fighting of the war: the Battle of Kursk, the advance across Ukraine, the crossing of the Dnieper River, the liberation of Poland, the final assault on Berlin. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel during an artillery barrage, once when his command post took a direct hit from a German tank. Both times he returned to duty within weeks. He received the Order of the Red Banner twice for bravery under fire. When the war ended in May 1945, Major Oleg Penkovsky had survived 4 years of combat. He was 26 years old. He had seen more death than most men see in a lifetime. He had also developed a skill that would define his future. He understood how intelligence could mean the difference between victory and disaster. After the war, Penkovsky's career accelerated. He was selected for the prestigious Frunze Military Academy in Moscow, the institution that trained future generals. He studied military strategy, logistics, and operational planning. He demonstrated an exceptional ability to analyze complex problems and produce clear recommendations. In 1948, at age 29, he was promoted to colonel. This was an extraordinary achievement for someone so young. It reflected both his combat record and his analytical abilities. More importantly, he had found a powerful patron, Marshal Sergei Vorontsov, commander of Soviet artillery forces. Vorontsov had noticed Penkovsky's talent during the war and took him under his wing. Vorontsov was a genuine war hero. He had commanded artillery during the siege of Leningrad and the Battle of Stalingrad. He was a member of the Central Committee. He had Stalin's ear. With Vorontsov's support, Penkovsky's career seemed unlimited. In 1949, Penkovsky enrolled in the Military Diplomatic Academy, known informally as the Conservatory. This was the training ground for Soviet military intelligence officers. Students learned foreign languages, diplomatic protocol, and intelligence tradecraft. Penkovsky studied English and mastered it completely. He learned how to assess foreign military capabilities, how to recruit sources, and how to operate undercover. He graduated in 1953 and was assigned to the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. His first foreign posting came in 1955. He was sent to Turkey as senior assistant to the military attaché, effectively the GRU resident in Ankara. This should have been the beginning of a brilliant intelligence career. Instead, it was the beginning of his disillusionment. In Turkey, Penkovsky behaved recklessly. He drank too much. He pursued relationships with foreign women. He spent money extravagantly. His superiors recalled him to Moscow after only 1 year. The official assessment was damning. Undisciplined, ambitious to the point of arrogance, prone to excessive drinking and unreliable behavior. He was fired from foreign intelligence work. His career appeared finished, but Marshal Vorontsov intervened. Vorontsov arranged for Penkovsky to attend advanced courses at the Dzerzhinsky Artillery Academy, where he studied missile technology. This was 1958, and the Soviet Union was racing to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles. Officers who understood rocket science were valuable. Penkovsky studied the R-7 Semyorka, the world's first ICBM. He learned about the R-12 and R-14 medium-range missiles. He studied warhead design, guidance systems, fuel chemistry, and launch procedures. Vorontsov then arranged for him to become an instructor at the academy, teaching missile technology to other officers. This position gave Penkovsky access to classified technical documentation. He read design specifications. He reviewed test results. He attended briefings on deployment schedules. And he began to understand a disturbing truth. The Soviet missile program was nowhere near as advanced as Khrushchev claimed. Moscow. Penkovsky sat in his office at GRU headquarters on Kodinka Airfield, reading a classified report. The document detailed the readiness status of Soviet strategic rocket forces. He read the numbers carefully, then read them again. According to the report, the Soviet Union had exactly 4 operational R-7 ICBMs. 4, not hundreds, not even dozens. 4 missiles sitting on exposed launch pads that would be destroyed in the first minutes of a nuclear war. He turned on his radio. The announcer was reading a statement from Premier Khrushchev. The Soviet Union now possesses rocket weapons so powerful and in such quantities that we can wipe out any aggressor. Our factories produce missiles like sausages. We have achieved decisive superiority. Penkovsky turned off the radio. He looked at the report again. 4 missiles. He thought about what this meant. American intelligence surely believed Soviet propaganda. They probably estimated hundreds of Soviet ICBMs. This meant American military planners might recommend a preemptive strike before the supposed Soviet advantage became insurmountable. Or American leaders might make dangerous concessions out of fear. Either way, the lie could start a nuclear war. Over the following months, Penkovsky read more classified materials. He learned that the R-16 ICBM, the next-generation missile, had exploded during a test in October 1960. The disaster killed 126 people, including Marshal Nedelin, commander of the Strategic Rocket Forces. This catastrophe had been completely covered up. Publicly, the Soviet missile program was triumphant. Privately, it was plagued by failures. He read reports on the R-12 Dvina medium-range missile. This weapon worked reliably, but it required hours to prepare for launch. The missiles sat on exposed transporters. Fuel had to be loaded. Warheads had to be mated to the missiles. Launch crews needed time for final checks. These were not weapons that could be fired quickly. Penkovsky also saw reports on Soviet air defense systems. They were inadequate. American U-2 spy planes flew over Soviet territory with impunity. In May 1960, Francis Gary Powers had been shot down only because his U-2 suffered mechanical failure and descended to an altitude where SA-2 missiles could reach it. Soviet radar could detect high-altitude aircraft but could not reliably track or engage them. The more Penkovsky read, the clearer the picture became. The Soviet Union was militarily weaker than the West believed. Its missile forces were limited. Its air defenses had gaps. Its leadership was gambling on deception and bluff. And if this deception failed, if the bluff was called, the result could be nuclear war based on miscalculation. Penkovsky made a decision. He would provide accurate information to the West, not because he was pro-Western, not because he hated the Soviet Union, but because he believed that truth was safer than lies. If American leaders knew the real state of Soviet capabilities, they could make rational decisions. He also had personal reasons. His career had stalled again. He had been passed over for a position as military attaché to India. The posting went to another officer with better connections. Penkovsky was stuck in a desk job at GRU headquarters, his ambitions thwarted by a system that rewarded loyalty over competence. In August 1960, Penkovsky traveled to Ankara as part of a Soviet trade delegation. He carried a letter addressed to the American embassy. The letter identified him as a GRU colonel willing to provide intelligence. It requested contact. He tried to deliver the letter to American students on the street. They did not understand. They walked away. He tried again with different Americans. No response. His mission failed. But Penkovsky did not give up. He returned to Moscow and began preparing for another opportunity. April 1961. London. Oleg Penkovsky stepped off the airplane at Heathrow Airport. He was part of a Soviet trade delegation attending an industrial exhibition. For months, he had waited for this moment. The delegation checked into a hotel in central London. Penkovsky unpacked his suitcase. Inside, hidden beneath clothing, was a package containing classified documents. Technical specifications for the R-12 missile, GRU organizational charts, assessments of Soviet military readiness. He had photographed these documents in Moscow using a Minox camera. Now he needed to deliver them. His contact was Greville Wynne, a British businessman who arranged trade exhibitions between Britain and the Soviet Union. Penkovsky had met Wynne during a previous visit to Moscow. What Penkovsky did not know until later was that Wynne worked for MI6, British intelligence. On his second evening in London, Penkovsky attended a reception for the trade delegation. Wynne was there, mingling with Soviet and British guests. The two men made eye contact across the room. Wynne nodded slightly. Penkovsky walked to the bathroom. A minute later, Wynne followed. They stood at adjacent sinks, washing their hands. No one else was present. "I have material for your government," Penkovsky said quietly in English. "Important material." Wynne kept his expression neutral. "What kind of material?" "Military intelligence, Soviet missile capabilities. I am a colonel in the GRU. I can provide information your country needs." Wynne dried his hands. "This is not something to discuss here. Can you meet tomorrow?" "Yes. Where?" Wynne provided an address, a flat in Kensington. Penkovsky memorized it. The two men left the bathroom separately. The next day, Penkovsky told his delegation colleagues he was going shopping. He took the underground to Kensington and found the address. He knocked. Wynne opened the door. Inside, two other men waited. One introduced himself as Harold Shergold, MI6. The other was Joe Bulick, CIA. Penkovsky handed them the package of documents. Shergold opened it and began reading. His expression changed immediately. "Where did you get this?" "From my office at GRU headquarters. I have access to classified technical intelligence." "Why are you doing this?" Penkovsky had prepared his answer. "Because my government is lying about our military strength. These lies could cause a war. I want to prevent that." The interrogation began. For hours, Shergold and Bulick asked technical questions. What was Penkovsky's position? What access did he have? How did he obtain these documents? Could he obtain more? Penkovsky answered every question. He described the GRU organizational structure in detail. He explained Soviet missile development programs. He provided specifications for multiple weapon systems. He demonstrated knowledge that only a genuine GRU officer would possess. By evening, Shergold and Bulick were convinced. This was real. They had a source inside Soviet military intelligence with access to strategic secrets. "We need to move carefully," Shergold said. "If you are discovered, you will be executed." "I understand the risk." "Can you travel to the West again?" "Possibly. I am being considered for positions that require foreign travel. We will provide you with equipment, a camera for photographing documents, materials for concealment, instructions for dead drops in Moscow. Can you handle that?" "Yes." They spent the next 3 days debriefing Penkovsky. He met with them every day, providing hours of detailed information. They gave him a new MI6 camera, specially modified with film that could capture documents in low light. They taught him how to photograph pages without leaving evidence. They established communication procedures. When Penkovsky returned to Moscow in May 1961, he was no longer just a GRU colonel. He was Hero, the code name given to him by MI6 and the CIA. He was the most valuable intelligence source the West had ever recruited from inside the Soviet military. He was also a man living on borrowed time. Moscow, summer 1961. Penkovsky returned to his routine at GRU headquarters. He attended meetings. He reviewed reports. He supervised subordinates. To his colleagues, he was the same ambitious, somewhat difficult officer they had always known. At night, in his apartment on Maxim Gorky Embankment, he became someone else. His wife, Vera, and their 2 daughters went to bed at 10 o'clock. Penkovsky waited until midnight. Then he locked himself in the bathroom, turned on the water to mask any sounds, and set up his miniature photography studio. He positioned a small desk lamp over the bathroom sink. He placed a glass sheet across the sink to create a flat surface. He laid classified documents on the glass. Above, he positioned the MI6 camera on an improvised stand made from coat hangers and tape. The MI6 was a marvel of German engineering, small enough to conceal in a closed fist. Each roll of film held 50 frames. Penkovsky could photograph 25 pages per roll, both sides of each page. He worked methodically. Align the document. Check the focus. Take the photograph. Advance the film. Turn the page. Repeat. A single session might last 3 hours. When he finished, his back ached from hunching over the sink. His eyes burned from the close work in dim light. He concealed the exposed film in everyday objects. He hollowed out the centers of boxes of chocolates sold in Moscow stores. He created false bottoms in medicine containers. He cut open cigarette packets, removed several cigarettes, inserted film canisters, and carefully resealed the packaging. Every week or two, he made a dead drop. MI6 had established multiple locations around Moscow: a crack in a stone wall near Gorky Park, a hollow in a tree in Sokolniki Park, a loose brick behind a bus shelter. Penkovsky developed a routine. On Sunday mornings, he would tell Vera he was going for a walk. He would dress warmly and stroll through Moscow like any other citizen enjoying his day off. He would stop at a newsstand and buy cigarettes. He would walk through a park. At some point during the walk, when he was certain no one was watching, he would approach the designated dead drop and leave his concealment device. Then he would continue his walk as if nothing had happened. Later that day, or perhaps the next day, an MI6 officer under diplomatic cover at the British Embassy would retrieve the drop. The officer would take a similar walk, approach the same location, and pocket the concealment device. Within 48 hours, the film would be in London, developed and analyzed. Between May 1961 and August 1962, Penkovsky delivered approximately 100 rolls of film, roughly 5,000 pages of classified documents, technical manuals for missile systems, internal GRU reports, minutes from Defense Council meetings, assessments of military readiness, order of battle information for Soviet forces in Eastern Europe. The intelligence was extraordinary. American analysts could now estimate Soviet missile capabilities with unprecedented accuracy. They knew how many ICBMs the Soviets possessed. They knew deployment locations. They knew technical specifications. Most importantly, they knew that Soviet strategic forces were far weaker than Khrushchev claimed. But the psychological strain on Penkovsky was immense. He could not trust anyone. Every colleague was a potential KGB informant. Every conversation could be a trap. Every unexpected question could be a test. He lived in constant awareness that discovery meant execution. He began drinking more heavily. He snapped at subordinates. His wife noticed the changes but attributed them to career frustration. She had no idea that her husband was committing treason on a scale unprecedented in Soviet history. The closest call came in March 1962. Penkovsky was photographing documents when he heard his daughter crying in the next room. He froze. Footsteps approached the bathroom door. His daughter tried the handle. It was locked. "Papa, I had a bad dream." Penkovsky's heart pounded. Documents were spread across the sink. The camera was visible. If anyone entered, everything would be exposed. "Papa is using the bathroom," he called out. "Go back to bed. I will come see you in a minute. I want Mama. Mama is sleeping. Go to bed. I will be there soon." He heard her footsteps retreat. He waited, listening. Silence. Moving quickly, he gathered the documents and hid them. He concealed the camera. He flushed the toilet for effect. Then he opened the door and went to comfort his daughter. That night, lying awake in bed, Penkovsky realized how fragile his operation was. One accident, one unexpected interruption, one moment of carelessness. Everything could end, but he continued. The stakes were too high to stop. July 1962, Penkovsky saw the orders. Soviet military units were being prepared for deployment to Cuba. Equipment manifests listed R-12 and R-14 missiles, launch vehicles, fuel transporters, and nuclear warheads. The operation was being conducted in absolute secrecy. Khrushchev was gambling that he could place nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida before the United States discovered them. Once operational, the missiles would dramatically shift the strategic balance. Soviet medium-range missiles in Cuba could reach most American cities. Khrushchev could then demand concessions: removal of American missiles from Turkey, recognition of East Germany, perhaps even American withdrawal from West Berlin. Penkovsky photographed the orders and passed them to his handlers. Within days, President Kennedy was informed that Soviet missiles were heading to Cuba. Through August and September, Soviet ships transported equipment to Cuba. American intelligence detected increased activity but initially believed the shipments contained only defensive weapons. U-2 flights over Cuba showed surface-to-air missile sites under construction, but no evidence of ballistic missiles. Then, on October 14th, a U-2 flight photographed suspicious construction near San Cristobal. Photo interpreters compared the images with specifications Penkovsky had provided. The dimensions matched, the layout matched. These were R-12 missile sites. Kennedy was informed on October 16th. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. For the next 13 days, the world balanced on the edge of nuclear war. Kennedy announced a naval blockade of Cuba. American warships took positions to intercept Soviet vessels. Strategic bombers dispersed to civilian airports, ready to launch nuclear strikes if ordered. In Florida, 100,000 troops assembled for a possible invasion. Across America, families watched the news in horror. Supermarkets ran out of canned goods as people prepared for nuclear war. Churches filled with people praying for survival. Schools conducted bomb drills, teaching children to hide under desks. Civil defense officials distributed instructions on building fallout shelters. In a suburb of Chicago, a factory worker named Robert Morrison spent his evenings in the basement, stacking canned food and jugs of water. His wife, Helen, tried to maintain normalcy for their 3 children, but even the youngest sensed the fear. 7-year-old Tommy asked his mother, "Are the Russians going to bomb us?" Helen did not know how to answer. In Moscow, Penkovsky continued his work under intensifying KGB surveillance. He knew the situation had reached its climax. He also knew he was being watched more closely than ever. But he continued photographing documents and making dead drops. The intelligence he provided during those 13 days helped American planners understand exactly what they faced. Penkovsky's reports confirmed that the missiles in Cuba were R-12s. He confirmed the launch preparation timeline, approximately 2 hours. He confirmed that warheads were stored separately. This information was critical to Kennedy's decision-making. It meant the missiles were not an immediate threat. They could not be launched without hours of preparation. There was time for diplomacy. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced that Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba. The crisis ended without nuclear war. Across America, families breathed again. Robert Morrison stopped stockpiling canned goods. Helen Morrison cried with relief. Tommy Morrison went back to worrying about baseball instead of bombs. President Kennedy never knew the name of the Soviet colonel whose intelligence had helped him navigate the crisis. But he knew that source existed, and he knew that source had potentially saved millions of lives. October 22, 1962. The same day Kennedy announced the naval blockade of Cuba, KGB officers knocked on Penkovsky's apartment door. It was 8 in the evening. Penkovsky was having dinner with Vera and their daughters. He opened the door. 6 men stood in the hallway. He recognized the KGB immediately. "Colonel Penkovsky, you are under arrest for treason against the Soviet Union." Vera screamed. The daughters started crying. KGB officers pushed past Penkovsky into the apartment. They began searching immediately, pulling books from shelves, opening drawers, tearing apart furniture. One officer found the Minox camera hidden in the bathroom. Another found undeveloped rolls of film. A third found documents that Penkovsky had not yet photographed, classified papers he should not have had at home. Penkovsky did not resist. He sat on the couch while KGB officers tore his life apart around him. His daughters clung to their mother. Vera stared at him in shock and horror. "Oleg, what have you done?" He had no answer. They took him to Lubyanka prison, KGB headquarters in central Moscow. For the next 6 months, he was interrogated. KGB officers wanted names, procedures, everything he had revealed to the West. They wanted to know who had recruited him, how he communicated, what information he had passed. Penkovsky confessed. He admitted working for British and American intelligence. He described his meetings in London and Paris. He named Greville Wynne as his contact. He explained the dead drop procedures. He detailed the types of information he had provided. The interrogations were brutal, but not physically torturous. The KGB did not need to beat information out of him. They had evidence. They had the camera, the film, the documents. Penkovsky knew resistance was pointless. What he did not reveal was his motivations. The KGB wanted to portray him as a traitor, motivated by money and Western decadence. Penkovsky insisted he had acted to prevent nuclear war. This explanation was not acceptable to his interrogators. The official narrative needed him to be a criminal, not a man of conscience. In November 1962, KGB officers arrested Greville Wynne during a business trip to Budapest. He was transported to Moscow and imprisoned alongside Penkovsky. Both men would face trial together. Vera Penkovsky was questioned extensively, but not arrested. The KGB concluded she had no knowledge of her husband's espionage. She was released, but placed under surveillance. Her life was destroyed. Neighbors shunned her. Friends stopped calling. Her daughters were bullied at school. She lived with the shame of being married to the most notorious traitor in Soviet history. The trial began on May 7, 1963, in the Hall of Columns in Moscow. The proceedings were public, televised for propaganda purposes. Foreign journalists were invited to observe. Penkovsky appeared in court looking gaunt. He had lost weight during imprisonment. He wore his military uniform, but his colonel's insignia had been torn off. He sat in a steel cage normally used for violent criminals. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The prosecutor presented the Minox camera, rolls of film, and photographs of classified documents. Witnesses testified that Penkovsky had accessed materials beyond his authorization. GRU colleagues described his behavior as suspicious and erratic. Penkovsky confessed in court. He admitted to espionage. He apologized for betraying his country. Whether this confession was coerced or genuine remains unknown. The proceedings were clearly staged for propaganda, but Penkovsky's words sounded sincere. "I betrayed my oath," he said. "I passed military secrets to foreign intelligence services. I endangered the security of the Soviet Union. I have no excuse for my actions." The court found him guilty of treason. The sentence was death. Greville Wynne received 8 years in prison. He would be released in 1964 in a spy exchange and returned to Britain. Soviet state media announced that Penkovsky was executed by firing squad on May 16, 1963. Western intelligence agencies believe he was actually executed earlier, possibly within days of his conviction. Some rumors suggest he was not shot but burned alive in a furnace, as an example to other potential traitors. The truth has never been confirmed. Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky was 44 years old when he died. Vera Penkovsky lived in Moscow until her death in 1990. She never remarried. She worked as a clerk, a humble job far below her education level. Her daughters grew up under the stigma of their father's treason. One became a teacher. The other became a librarian. Both avoided public attention. The apartment on Maxim Gorky Embankment, where Penkovsky had photographed classified documents, was reassigned to another family. No plaque marks it. No memorial acknowledges what happened there. Greville Wynne returned to Britain and published a memoir in 1967 titled The Man from Moscow. He described his role in the Penkovsky operation and his imprisonment in Soviet jails. He struggled with alcoholism and died in 1990. Marshal Sergei Vorontsov, Penkovsky's patron, was demoted and forced into retirement. He was not arrested, but his career was finished. His association with the traitor made him politically unreliable. He died in obscurity in 1971. The GRU implemented sweeping security reforms after Penkovsky's arrest. Access to classified materials was restricted. Document handling procedures were tightened. Officers faced more intensive screening and surveillance. The reforms made it harder for future Penkovskys to emerge, but they also made the intelligence apparatus more rigid and less effective. In the West, Penkovsky's intelligence was analyzed for years. His technical documentation on Soviet missiles proved accurate and valuable well into the 1970s. His insights into GRU organizational structure helped Western counterintelligence identify and track Soviet intelligence officers worldwide. The full extent of his contributions was not publicly acknowledged until the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. CIA documents declassified in 1998 confirmed that Penkovsky had provided intelligence critical to American decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 2007, a retired CIA officer named Pete Bagley wrote, "Oleg Penkovsky may have saved the world from nuclear war." That sounds like hyperbole, but I believe it is literally true. His intelligence gave President Kennedy the confidence to pursue a diplomatic solution instead of immediate military action. Without that intelligence, Kennedy might have ordered airstrikes against Cuba, which almost certainly would have triggered Soviet retaliation and escalation to nuclear war. This assessment was shared by others who reviewed the historical record. Penkovsky's information allowed Kennedy to understand that Soviet missiles in Cuba were not yet operational. There was time. That time created space for diplomacy. Who was Oleg Penkovsky, traitor or hero? The answer depends on perspective. Soviet authorities called him a traitor, a man who betrayed his country for money and Western promises. This narrative served a political purpose. It discouraged other potential defectors and reinforced the message that cooperation with the West was treason. But the evidence suggests a more complex picture. Penkovsky did not defect. He remained in Moscow, living under constant threat of discovery. He did not seek asylum in the West when he had opportunities to do so during trips to London and Paris. He returned to the Soviet Union knowing he could be arrested at any moment. He accepted money from MI6 and the CIA, but the amounts were modest. He was not living a lavish lifestyle. The money went largely unspent, hidden in his apartment. Financial gain does not appear to have been his primary motivation. What drove him was a conviction that Soviet propaganda about missile superiority was dangerous. He believed that lying about military capabilities increased the risk of war through miscalculation. He thought providing accurate information to the West would reduce that risk. Was he right? The historical evidence suggests yes. Kennedy's confidence that Soviet missiles in Cuba were not yet operational came directly from Penkovsky's intelligence. That confidence allowed Kennedy to pursue a blockade instead of airstrikes. The blockade created time for negotiation. Negotiation prevented war. If Kennedy had believed the worst-case scenario, that Soviet missiles could be launched immediately, he might have ordered immediate strikes. Soviet casualties would have been inevitable. Khrushchev would have had to retaliate to maintain credibility. The situation would have escalated. Instead, the crisis ended peacefully. Khrushchev removed the missiles. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. Both sides stepped back from the brink. Millions of people who lived through October 1962 never knew how close they came to annihilation. They did not know that their survival depended partly on intelligence provided by a Soviet colonel working in secret, photographing documents in his bathroom at midnight, living a double life under constant surveillance. Oleg Penkovsky operated for 18 months. He delivered 5,000 pages of classified intelligence. He shaped one of the most important events of the 20th century. He paid with his life. History remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis as Kennedy's finest hour, a moment when leadership and restraint prevented catastrophe. That is partly true. But it is also true that Kennedy's decisions were informed by intelligence from a man whose name most Americans have never heard. Penkovsky lies in an unmarked grave somewhere in Moscow. There is no monument. No street bears his name. In Russia, he remains a traitor. In the West, he is largely forgotten, a footnote in Cold War history. But for those 13 days in October 1962, when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war, Oleg Penkovsky was the invisible hand that steadied the balance. He was the man in the shadow who prevented catastrophe. He deserves to be remembered.